Begin with the rapidly unfolding developments in the Middle East. Hamas emergency officials in Gaza say an Israeli strike on the northern town of Beit Lahia has killed at least 60 Palestinians. Just a warning that the pictures we're about to show you contain some graphic images of the aftermath of the attack. Well, the footage shows bodies wrapped in blankets alongside the rubble of the multi-story residential building. Others remain buried. Rescuers say that locals and displaced people were killed, including many women and children. Well, Israel has recently intensified its military operations in northern Gaza, where it says it's trying to stop Hamas from regrouping. It also comes as the United Nations Secretary General has warned Israel that its decision to ban the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, Unrwa, from operating in the country could have, quote, devastating consequences for Gaza and the West Bank. Two laws were passed by a large majority in the Israeli parliament, which will ban Unrwa from carrying out any of its activities in Israel and also restricts its communication with the Israeli government, which are seen as crucial, especially in allowing the aid to cross into Gaza. Well, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Unrwa workers must be held accountable for what he called their terrorist activities against the country. Well, there's been widespread condemnation of the move by Israel. The US says it's urged Israel not to pass the law, while the UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer said he was gravely concerned. Well, to take us through all the developments coming out of the Middle East, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Ben Brown in Jerusalem.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. And the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset, passed this legislation, these two separate bills, absolutely overwhelmingly last night, despite a wave of international pressure on them not to do so. Now, we're talking here about a United Nations refugee agency that has been around since 1949, helping millions of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank especially. But Israel claims that Unrwa, this agency, has colluded with Hamas and that some of its staff were involved in the October the 7th attacks. Well, my colleague earlier, Gaby Tanoli, was speaking to Sharon Haskell, who is a member of Israel's parliament and was proposing this legislation.
When we understand that Unrwa staff have participated in the 7th of October massacre, where many of them are activists or first family members of Hamas members, where just 3 months ago, the head of the union of the teachers of Unrwa was appointed knowingly. He's a high commander in Hamas, and the United Nations hasn't done anything about it. We had to act. I think that even in London, if an international organization would have participated in a massacre of English people in London, I don't believe it would take more than 24 hours until the British government would kick them out of the country.
The US State Department has said that the US has contacted Israel to express its deep concern. So has the UK. But what is going to be the impact of this? The humanitarian situation, as we know, is desperate.
Well, I think that part of the problem was Unrwa. When Hamas has stolen more than 50% of the humanitarian good and then sold it in the market to people who couldn't afford it, that's when the humanitarian crisis really started. We need real organization with real capability, with the logistic capability, like the real United Nations agency who are looking after the disaster areas in Syria and in Sudan, and with millions of people who were affected by it. They have the logistic, they have the capability, they have the resources to actually provide humanitarian aid.
Well, that was Sharon Haskell, a member of the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset, speaking a little bit earlier on. There's no doubt that this legislation, and it takes effect in 90 days, will have devastating consequences for UNRWA's work in Gaza and the West Bank. And in fact, that's exactly what the United Nations Secretary General has said, that it will be devastating. Lots of other world leaders have also condemned this move. UNRWA has said that this legislation, this vote last night, is a breach of international law. And we can talk now and hear from Sam Rose, who's the Senior Deputy Director for Gaza at that UN agency, UNRWA.
We're not an intelligence operation. We have investigatory capability, but we have taken immediate and strong and direct action against any allegations that we have received. This is proven in terms of the actions that the Unrwa Commissioner General has taken and the actions that have been referred to other bodies within the United Nations. I refute any claim that we do not take these actions seriously and that we have not taken action. I mean, what we've seen in this conflict over the past 13 months is all sorts of red lines crossed in terms of the brutality that's being meted out on a civilian population here as a result of the horrific events of the 7th of October. And we call constantly and consistently for a ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. But I can tell you without any doubt that the plight of the civilian population inside Gaza will get immeasurably worse if and when these bills are implemented. There's absolutely no doubt about that. There are no other organizations that can pick up the bulk of what UNRWA does in terms of its operations here. No one has 13,000 staff, 75 years of knowledge, of understanding of the community here. It simply will not be possible.
So that was Sam Rose from UNRWA. And let's speak to our Middle East correspondent, Elan Nell, who's here with me in Jerusalem. Elan, just explain then how this legislation that was passed last night by the Knesset will have an impact on this key United Nations agency.
Well, the Israeli Prime Minister's office is underlining that it says there'll be 3 months before this takes effect, and it's going to work in that time, it says, with world partners to try to sort out this aid situation. But if you look at the legislation, there are 2 parts to it. One which basically bans UNRWA in Israel and in Israeli annexed territory, that's in East Jerusalem. And then there's another part which bans the Israeli authorities from really having anything to do with the organization. And that's where it's going to have a big impact on Gaza and the West Bank under Israeli military occupation, because in order to get aid into those places, in order for international staff to move around, that all requires coordination, especially with the Israeli military. And if you look at Gaza in particular, well, that is where UNRWA is the biggest UN agency on the ground. So we've seen during the war that it has become the biggest distributor of aid, and it's also, of course, running these wartime shelters with so many premises in Gaza, turning them over to displaced people. So that's why, you know, this is really causing such a lot of alarm.
Okay, Elan, thank you very much indeed. Elan Nell, our Middle East correspondent. Let's just talk briefly now about the latest situation in Lebanon, where there have been more Israeli airstrikes. Now, the government's health ministry in Lebanon says at least 60 people have been killed in those latest airstrikes, mainly in the east of the country. They hit 5 areas in the Baalbek region, northeast of the capital, Beirut. The local governor called the attacks the most violent in the area since Israel escalated the conflict against Hezbollah last month. The eastern Bekaa Valley, a stronghold of Hezbollah. Another 7 people killed in Israeli strikes in the coastal city of Tyre. And Hezbollah has also announced that Naim Qassem, who's the group's deputy secretary general, will become its new head, its new leader. That's replacing the long-term leader Hassan Nasrallah, who you will remember was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Beirut last month. Let's get the latest then from our Beirut correspondent Hugo Basher, who can join me now from the Lebanese capital. Hugo, just talk us through the latest Israeli action in Lebanon and another large death toll overnight.
Yeah, Ben, it was a very violent night of Israeli airstrikes in the east of the country, in the Bekaa Valley. 16 areas were hit, and those attacks happened with no warning by the Israeli military. There hasn't been reaction from the Israeli army explaining those attacks, what was being targeted with those airstrikes last night. But the Lebanese health ministry is saying that at least 60 people were killed, including 2 children, and images that have been posted on social media show widespread destruction in some of those areas, also fires that were sparked by those airstrikes. And the head of the civil defense in Baalbek said that those airstrikes happened at the same time last night, that residential buildings were hit. And in one village, the village of Budai, residents overnight pleaded on social media for heavy equipment to be sent to the area to help in those rescue efforts. So that gives you a sense of the desperate situation there following those airstrikes. And this morning in another village, rescue efforts continued for 5 people who are still missing following those airstrikes. This is an area of the country that has been repeatedly hit by the Israeli military. It is an area where Hezbollah has a very strong presence. It is a strategic route connecting Hezbollah to its allies in Iraq and Syria, and also to Iran, which is obviously Hezbollah's main supporter. But as you mentioned in the introduction, the governor of Baalbek saying that the attacks last night were the most violent in his region since the beginning of this conflict.
And Hugo, not surprisingly, given that level of military activity in Lebanon by the Israelis, a lot of Lebanese civilians on the move who have been displaced, who've had to get out of their various towns and cities to try and seek safety.
Exactly. 1.2 million people have been forced to flee their homes because of this conflict since the escalation of this conflict 5 weeks ago. And many of these people have left the south of the country, where we've seen this massive campaign by the Israeli military against Hezbollah, not only with intense airstrikes, but also with a ground invasion. So villages in the country now occupied by the Israeli military. Also a huge displacement of residents from the east of the country, from the Bekaa Valley, and also from the city's southern suburbs here in Beirut. Once Hezbollah's beating hard here in the capital, where Hezbollah is based, again now a ghost town because of those Israeli airstrikes and also a number of evacuation orders by the Israeli military. So this has obviously put a lot of pressure on the local authorities here, on public services, has exacerbated sectarian divisions in this country. And again, the authorities are saying that if there's no ceasefire and if this conflict continues, this is going to obviously put even more pressure on the authorities and on cities and towns across the country, having now to absorb this huge wave of residents who've been displaced because of this conflict.
Okay, Hugo, thank you very much. Hugo Basher there for us in Beirut. Let's go back now to that highly controversial vote in the Israeli parliament last night, where members of the parliament, the Knesset, voted overwhelmingly, essentially to have nothing more to do with the United Nations refugee agency, Unrwa, which has been working with Palestinian refugees since 1949 and helps millions of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. So Israel effectively cutting off all cooperation with Unrwa. The UN General Secretary has said that it will have devastating consequences in terms of aid. And this was a parliamentary vote carried out really in defiance of international pressure. And once it went through, it has caused an international outcry. Well, we can talk more about it to Noga Tarnopolsky, who's a journalist who's based here in Jerusalem. And just talk us through, Noga, the thinking of those parliamentary members in the Knesset. Why were they so keen to push this legislation through in defiance of international calls for them not to do so?
Hi, I think there are many reasons. One is that this government has very successfully turned UNRWA into a kind of bête noire of the entire mishandled situation in Gaza over the last many years. And I have to say that in some respects, UNRWA has not done itself any favors, because it does appear that they accommodated Hamas and have taken very lightly some of Israel's accusations. That said, Israel has provided little evidence for all of its accusations against UNRWA. So we find ourselves in a situation in which UNRWA has become a kind of de facto governing authority for Palestinians, not just in Gaza, also in Lebanon, Palestinian refugees everywhere, in the West Bank, in Jordan. And it's the one refugee agency, the only one that doesn't resettle refugees. It simply maintains them. And so Israel has increasingly complained against it. And yesterday you had members of Netanyahu's government even, really screeching in parliament that UNRWA itself is a terror organization. In part, I have to say, I do think in part this is a way of not addressing the prime minister, Netanyahu's own responsibility for having chosen to support Hamas for many years as against the Palestinian Authority.
Okay, Noga, thank you very much indeed. Noga Tarnopolsky, they're a journalist based here in Jerusalem. The legislation, by the way, won't take effect for 3 months. And as we were hearing earlier from Elan Nell, the Israeli government are saying they'll work with other aid agencies in the meantime to try and fill the gap left behind by UNRWA's work.